Recordings in progress. Morei v'chaverai and Rabosai. This is the third week we're spending in this parak. And b'siyata d'shmaya, we should finish parak Yud Zayin this week. We spent our first year discussing why we're talking about Tzidkiyahu here. Mentioned 4 other times in Tanakh, the story, the answer being that we really didn't get a full story. So we're getting it over here. I will tell you now, skipping a little bit more to the punchline, you got to go deeper into this story to get the full story over here. It's not really told without going to other different sources. Last week, we talked about we also talked about the first week about the format, about mashal and chida, a parallel and a riddle. We talked about 2 eagles. We talked about the eagle of Nebuchadnezzar in Bavel, and we talked about the eagle, which might be a vulture or a buzzard, which was Paro Chofra. And we talked about how they differ. We talked about the body structure of the two of them, how one was more impressive than the other, and how the buzzard is not a bird of prey as the vulture is, because the vulture is a rodef. Excuse me, the eagle is a rodef. The eagle hunts its prey, which is a more noble, majestic bird for some reason. And we talked about what the punishment was going to be. That's what we talked about. So here we are, what's left to say? Well, we have another, from 11 to 24, we have another 14 psukim to finish this parak. And what are we going to talk about? What are we doing? So I like to give titles to this shiurim, and this title I call The Bond of an Oath and the Consequences for Breaking It. And I subtitled it, Your Arms Are Too Short to Box with God. Because basically, that's a show. I saw a marquee for it in the subway every time I went through Times Square to go to the subways that went to the east side of town. I saw that thing for I don't know, for a year, and it emblazoned itself in my brain. But it really is telling you, you can't mess with the Rebbeinu Shalom, which is the deal. So if we want to know what this is all about, the first thing I did was I took a look in the Das Mikra, and the Das Mikra gives us 2 explanations of the riddle, he says, that complement each other. And I skipped around a little bit in my underlining to just give you what I felt was the most important. He says, there are 2 reasons for the punishment in Yechezkel's Nevuah. He says, and the explanation differs from the explanation that Yirmiyahu gave in his Nevuos. Remember again, just backdrop for every single week, there's 30 years separating the periods of Nevuah. For Yechezkel is 30 years later to the party than is Yirmiyah, but they're talking about the same things surrounding the same events, which are the Churban Bayis. And what is the first reason here? And he says, Ze bizayon ha'Allah v'chafaras habris. This is the embarrassment is a bad word. The denigration, he says, and the reneging on a covenant between Tzidkiyahu and Bavel, that we were supposed to agree to be a subservient nation, and we were not going to try and rise above our station. So this is going to be my underlying theme. So we reneged on a promise. Big whoop. Who are we reneging on a promise to? It's like, we're reneging on a promise that we're going to make to Turkey. Do we really care? Well, we'll find out. That's the first. The second reason is Chilul Kvod Hashem, that we care about. Chilul Hashem, Chilul of the honor of God. He says, and the bris, Afi Nichrasa B'Shem Hashem. Nebuchadnezzar may have been a cruel individual, he may have been uncultured, but he wasn't stupid. he had Yirmiyah, he had Tzidkiyahu swear in God's name. We dealt about that a little bit, I think in the first year we gave about this, where he swore, he reneged on his oath, and he was called in with the entire Besdin, or called in front of Nebuchadnezzar, and his excuse was, well, I went to Besdin, and Besdin let me renege on my oath. So, like I said, he may have been cruel, but he wasn't stupid. And he said, can a person renege on an oath? Can I have like Mayfair Neder? Can you retract your oath if the person who is also involved is not present? And they said, the answer is no. And we know that they were very severely punished. And they said, if a person does, he said, if the person who breaks this covenant and he is injurious to the name of God, that's a sin he must carry. And Yirmiyahu talks about the rebellion of Tzidkiyahu and his hate against Hashem by doing it. And he says that there were Edom, Moab, Ammon, Sor, and Sidon, and us were all tried to make them into vassal states for Nebuchadnezzar. And he was the overarching monarch. And he says, the Avru also Kolagoyim, they all tried to band together against him. And his son and his son's son, until they came to his land, Gamhu v'lachein loto il habris. This covenant will not help. She'oson artzos menasos hakim birshuso shel Tzidkiyahu. They were trying to ride his coattails and trying to form an alliance against Nebuchadnezzar. V'acharei kein Hashem etenes Tzidkiyahu melech Yehuda v'esavadav yesa'am biyad Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel, which is what we find in Yirmiyah. Okay, two reasons. The first reason is that we were supposed to be a subservient nation, but who told us to be a subservient nation? We were told this in Yeshaya, we were told this in Yirmiyah, and clearly both Nevi'im are informed by the Rebbeinu Shalom that that's what is expected of us. So in going against what we said we're going to do, we're going against God. And the second is, when you swear in the name of God, then clearly you are very mightily angering God to do something like this. Okay, that's our background. So if we go to the Psukim, so Vayidvar Hashem Elai Lemor, Pasuk Yud Aleph, God came to me. It says, Emor no leves hameri. Meri means disobedience. Who's based on Meri? Us. He says, Halo yadatem ma'ele. Halo is a very interesting word. The Mefarshim say, have you not been able to figure out what I've been talking about in the previous mashal, the previous riddle? He says, Emor hine va. I'm telling you, Melech Bavel, Yerushalayim, the king of Babylonia is coming to Yerushalayim. The Yikaches Malka, he will take its king, Hamelech Shelah, not Malka meaning the queen, V'yasareha, its princes, its officers, all the important people. V'yaveosam elav bavela. In case you didn't know, that's what's going down over here. It's Pasuk Yud Beis. Now, Mitzudas David, on page 255, explains it very, very well. So he says that would be on page 255, the bottom Perush, and it's the wider lines in the art scroll Mikros Gedolos. Lebeis Haneri Beis Yisrael Hamam Rim B says, now God took this seriously. You disobeyed me. And he says, Hello Yedatim, hello Tuchlu Ladas Lavin Mahen Ela Dvarim. You can't figure out what I've been saying to you? Alma Yirmizu, what they are alluding to, says Emor. This is what they mean. Emor is Pisron Hadvarim. It is the explanation. It's the key. Melech Bavel, Behu Pisron Hanesher Hagadol. That is the big eagle. He says, that's Melech Bavel equals the big eagle, Harishon, the first one. Yerushalayim is what is meant by Halevanon. Yerushalayim is what we call Lebanon, because the cedar, Lebanon was known, Lebanon was known for its majestic cedar trees, which were taller, and that's what we were known as. He says, Esmalka, Yesoreha, says that is the explanation of Sameres or Eres, the treetop of the cedar tree. Uketifas Hayon Kos, and cutting off the suckling branches, says V'al Yehoyachin v'sarav Yomar, and about Yehoyachin and his officers will be said, Shelikachum Nebuchadnezzar b'Gola. You will take them into Golas. All this information is basically what it was all about. But I'll tell you now, I looked in the original Mikros Gedolos, and it was not presented nearly as well, the same material as presented here. There is in the Malbim, if you'll take a look, Mara Yechezkel HaMalbim, he has each pasuk here, how it lines up with one element of the parable or the riddle. It'll say this equals this equals that equals that. I'm not going to go into each one of them, but that is what the Malbim does. And if you want to, you can really very simply look at Yud Gimel. He tells you Le'el Pasuk Hey. You want to know what Pasuk Hey says? Look at Pasuk Hey. But that is what, in other words, he tells you how each element here answers an element there. It means God is telling you, I'm giving you exactly what I meant to tell you. Okay. Now, I just also thought it'd be interesting to note that where it says Malka, according to Rashi, that's Yehoyakim. But if you look at Rabbi Eliezer in the Radak, he says it's Yehoyachin. And if you look at Steinsaltz, he says it's Yechonia. I think Yechonia and Yehoyachin are probably the same person, but there's definitely a difference of opinion. Who the king we're talking about, is it Yehoyakim or is it Yehoyachin? So clearly there is a distinction between the two of them. Now, we'll go into how Reb Steinsaltz, Zecher Tzadik V'Kadosh L'Bracha, teaches out these psukim, does a fantastic job. So, as you know, the format of Steinsaltz is he gives you the words of the Navi and he gives you their explanation, following them in line. So, Pasuk Yud Gimel says, Vayikach gam mizera hamlucha. And he says, Nebuchadnezzar bachar bidodo shel Yechonia. So he's holding that Yehoyachin was the one we're talking about. He took Yehoyachin's nephew. His name is Matanya. Matanya is Tzidkiyahu. He was renamed Tzidkiyahu, basically. So Nebuchadnezzar is telling him, you stay true to your oath, because I put you into office. Umino, so Lamelech chosen to be king. He coronated him to the king of Yehuda. Vayichros ito bris, and he made a covenant with him. Vayaveo so bi Allah, and he brought him. He says bishvua shehesbia Nebuchadnezzar Tzidkiyahu. He says he made him swear an oath to uphold the covenant. Says Kerucha, entwined with this oath is a klola. is a curse in yafer osa if you do not follow the bris. So one is entwined with the other. And all this is going to be leading up to the punchline about what this oath was, why this oath was, what did he do that made the king so angry that he couldn't live with it. Okay, if we look at Pasuk Yud Daled, we'll go one more Pasuk in Steinsaltz. He says, what is it? Lehiyos mamlacha shvala. Be a subservient nation, levilti hisnaseh, and don't try and change that around. Don't try and become mighty. Lishmar es briso le'amda l'kaima. I want you to do this to keep it. Now, I'll tell you, Pasuk, there's an interesting piece that he says in Steinsaltz. He says, Nebuchadnezzar, his credo was not to destroy Yehuda. But, he says, She tisrod kimamlacha ketana, that it should be a satellite. It should be a vassal state. Tachas chasuso. It should be under his protectorate, under his patronage. That's what he says. So let's go weiter, but there are other things to be said about the Pasuk. Now, on Rav Breuer, on Psukim Yud Gimel and Yud Daled, very well, he says that Tzidkiah had taken an oath of loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. The Hefer, you look at Pasuk Tesvav, he says, Vayimrod bo, and he rebelled against him. The pronouns, of course, are misleading, but it does mean Tzidkiah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. L'shloch malachav, he sent messengers to Mitzrayim. To who? To Paro Chafra, who we called the buzzard. L'seislo susim v'amrav, bring me your famous Egyptian horses that we were never supposed to go back to Egypt to get. We were specifically enjoined from doing it. And to Shlomo HaMelech, we were enjoined not to do it. But apparently they were a very big draw. V'amrav, and bring me a lot of people. Hayitzlach, Hayimaleit, Ha'osei Elah, the Hefer Bris, the Nimaleit. You have to look at what he said. Hayitzlach, he said, it's going to be successful. Bitmiyah with a question mark. Hayimaleit, Ha'oseh Elah. He says, when a person does this, is he going to be able to save himself? Will he be able to escape? The Hefer Bris V'Nimlat, he says he broke a covenant. Is he going to be allowed to live, to get away? He asked it a question. And just so I can line it up with what he says, Pasuk Tes Zayin says, Chai ani, Lashon of Shvua. This is, says God, Hashem Elokim, im lo b'makom hamelech hamamlich. He says, oh, so if he will not follow the words, you'll see the end of it. The grammar is a little broken up. Asher baza es alaso. If not in the place that the king who coronated him, put him on the throne, he says, whose oath he embarrassed, the asher he fair and broke, as Briso, his covenant, he told Bavel Yamus. The grammar is all messed up. And he's saying, do you think he's not going to die in the not in his own bed, but in the land of Nebuchadnezzar, who put him on the throne, whose bris he broke? So he says, the Hafer, only in the quote Jewish Bible, he says, can we find the most eloquent protest against any attempt to separate political expediency from personal morality and to perpetuate the miseries of history by creating a so-called double standard. Nice English. With one set of rules for individuals and quite another for nations to follow. In other words, I expect that I'm going to deal with David and with Bruce and with Marvin and with Dove and with Marty on one level, But if we're dealing on a national level, the same set of rules don't count. The state, too, must consider its word, once given, as sacred. Covenants and alliances must not be broken by considerations of political expediency. Not even a state or its representative, the king, may take the name of God lightly. You have to understand, what are we getting at? I know I read it, but Farish said, the person who swears in God's name and breaks that promise, albeit to somebody who is not Jewish, how was he bound to the God in whose name he's sworn? Won't he break other rules, other agreements? He says, and he must remember that they owe allegiance to God. This is a truth to which Tzidkiah's own tragic fate will attest for all time to come. Now, on this very same pasuk, Reb Eisenman says, Lios mamlacha shvala levilti ti hisnase, be a lowly kingdom that might not be elevated. Now, if you look at Yirmiyah Chaf Hey Tes, refers to Nebuchadnezzar as Eved Hashem. I remember we were learning this caught in my craw. Nebuchad, who did we call Eved Hashem? Moshe. And we called Nebuchadnezzar Eved Hashem? You know why? Because he was God's instrument. Right. And it says that the Babylonian king wields against Egypt, the sword he wields against Egypt, described as my, parenthesis, God's sword. Now, God is creator of the world and as master of its history has willed that all the countries on earth should bow to Babylonian rule. This is in Yirmiyah, Perek Chav Zayin, if you guys will remember. Yirmiyah addressed a special message to, let me see, special message to Tzidkiyahu. This is an unforgettable scene. In that scene, he comes with a bunch of wooden yokes. We were the top power. Mm-hmm. They all came to us. We held it, we were the power in the alliance. These nations that I just mentioned came to Jerusalem for a summit meeting. And Yirmiyah walked around with a bunch of wooden yokes. 6 of them were on his neck. And apparently he walked around with these yokes on his neck for 3 years, I believe. And then he took them and gave to each of them. He said, come on, take a yoke, put it on your neck. He says, you know why? If you put the yoke on your neck, the yoke representative of subservience to Babel, you will live. You pay a little bit more taxes, it's Rebbe Geld, but you won't be annihilated. He says, bring your necks under the yoke of the Babylonian king and serve him and his people and live. Why should you die, you and your people, by sword, in famine, and in plague? That was a triumvirate, because when people are killed in battle and sword, and they die and there's no time to bury them, he says, then there's a plague. He said, if there's nobody can get out to bring food stores, and if it's unsafe to walk the street, they die in famine. One is in hand with the other. As God has threatened for such nations as would not serve the Babylonian king. That is in Perek Yud Beis, Psukim Yud Beis and Yud Gimel, within that Perek in Yirmiyah. Thus, the idea of the Mamlacha Shvala, the lowly kingdom which Nebuchadnezzar wanted to impose upon Jerusalem, was God's direct wish for his people. Had Tzidkiyahu accepted the destiny imposed upon him, tragedy would have been averted. His refusal to submit and the events which resulted from it make up the story of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and Golus Babel.
It still doesn't. It still has trouble flying. That because one king is made this terrible mistake against God. Yeah, he gets punished, but I can't understand that the whole nation gets destroyed so brutally just because of him.
I hear what you're asking. Would anybody like to respond to David?
You just said, had he not made that mistake, they wouldn't have been punished.
Had he not made that, okay. The king is the leader. As the king goes, so go the people. The people went along with what he said. They're more than happy to buy into it and to oppose him because, after all, who was Yirmiyahu? He's just a prophet. These are guys who got killed. And they, number one, were they God-fearing people? No. And they put their faith in their king, Naomi says, as opposed to putting their faith in God. They weren't God-fearing people. They weren't Shomer Torah or mitzvos. These were not the best of times, nor were we the best of people. David's not happy.
No, it's not what it says. I'm just reading what it says.
Go ahead.
He's just blaming the whole destruction on the fact that the king erred in his judgment. All right, it was a terrible error on the king's judgment, but God should not be destroying a whole people so brutally just because of the king's bad judgment.
The answer is, if that were true, you would be right. If it was strictly based upon the king's bad judgment, as you called it, you'd be right, but it wasn't.
I would like to suggest an answer to David, if I may.
Please.
I'm stretching a little bit, but it's an interesting concept, and I appreciate David's comment very much. So I would like to suggest the following answer. We are taught that in the Ir HaMiklat, if somebody, B'shogeg, I kill somebody with Shogeg, I flee to an Ir Miklat. And when do I stay there? I stay there until the change in the Kohen Gadol. What does the life of a Kohen Gadol have to do with me? Why would I be more years or less years in the Ir Miklat? What does my deed have to do with the Kohen? And I think the suggestion, if I remember correctly, is that the person on top basically is a combination. In other words, it's one of these old saws. What comes first, the horse or the wagon? But I mean, it's the people who choose the king, and it's the king who leads the people. So the old axiom, a fish stinks from the head. Perhaps it's the king who did not get good counsel, who did not get good advice, who was not guided in the right way, who did not have a people behind him. It probably is more prevalent to err than a president who has good counsel, who has a good cabinet, who has people behind him. It's just a suggestion. It's stretching a little bit, David, and I apologize.
Go for it. No, that's fine.
I think it might. I think maybe it's. I hear your question. I think maybe it'll help you deal with that question. It's an excellent question, and I appreciate it, and I've always thought about the situation of the Ir Miklat with the relationship to the accidental murder and the Kohen, and perhaps this might be somewhat of an answer to you. I don't know how much comfort it gives you, but hopefully maybe it's something. It's another way to view it. No, I apologize.
Why you
apologize?
Let me call to your attention a scene that was personally I found chilling. We have a group of loyalists, they're loyal to Yirmiyah, who has spent time writing Megillas Eicha, putting down a chronicle of every nevuah he ever had, because God asked him to do it, and he had a secretary. And first he was writing it all down himself. And he goes And the Megillah, Yirmiyah can't even venture forth because he's going to get killed. So his secretary goes out with this Megillah and he reads it to the soldiers who are out in the courtyard. And they turn white as a sheet. And they take it and they bring it. Picture this scene. Here is the king sitting in his winter palace.
Who's the king?
Who was the king? The king was Tzidkiyahu.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting in his winter palace with a roaring fire. It's described in the pasuk. And he has the Megillah in front of him. He reads it. He sees Shem Hashem. He takes a razor. He cuts it off and throws it into the fire. Piece by piece by piece by piece. He takes the chronicle and he's surrounded by soldiers. You know what they do? Nothing. They were complicit. They have this evidence which should have said, this is the time that we rebel. No. So the king was bad. The people were bad. The people were sinners. Yirmiyahu, at one point in time, loyal servant that he was asked to go out in the streets of Jerusalem and find a tzaddik. It's compared to Sodom. And he goes into the streets. God didn't ask for 50. He didn't ask for 40, 30, 20, 10. It's for one. And Yirmiyahu's game. He goes out to the streets of Yerushalayim. And he comes back and he can't find a single tzaddik. And we say, impossible, say the Mefarshim. Say, you know what it is? We find a tzaddik. Sure, what's a tzaddik? A Talmid Chacham. Er sitzt in a steigt, he's sitting and he's learning. But he doesn't go out to the streets and tell people to do tshuva. He doesn't teach. So you know what? He's not a tzaddik. One complete, faithful Jew could not be found. It's possible that Jew did enough by his learning that he escaped being killed and he was allowed to go into Golus. But he's not a complete person. He didn't try and get anybody else. Noach, give the example of Noach. He said, did Noach try and save the people? So the bottom line is, unless you got the whole package, unless you can influence others, b'mkom she'ein ish heyeh ish. When there's not a man who stands up as a man, you got to be a man. And the answer is, there were no men. They were not a good bunch of people. It was not one bad king and a nation of good people who were a bunch of sheep. Nobody was good, David. And don't let's fool ourselves.
No, I understand that. I understand that there is that the people are also sinners and so on. But that's simply not what Yechezkel's saying. I'm just relating to what's here in the text. The text is very clear that the destruction is brought on because the king made an oath in God's name and he failed the oath. That's it. Had he not done it, there wouldn't have been the destruction. It's black and white.
I hear your point.
So
I accept what you're saying. Now I'm going to say, okay, Pasuk Yud Zayin. I think we've read all of Psukim through Tesvav. The Tesvav says, no, we did read it. Now look at Pasuk Tes Zayin. Chai ani ne'um Hashem Elokim. We already read that. If the king is going to die safely in his bed, not happening. Listen to Pasuk Yud Zayin. Pasuk Yud Zayin. Lo b'chayil gadol ubekahol rav yaseh oso paro chafra. He's not bringing you a big army. He says to go to war for you. He says bishfoch solallah. You know what that means? They would make a hill. They make a hill so they'd be easier to go into battle. He says ubivnos doyek. Doyek is like a fort. No one's doing this for you. Lachris nafshos rabos. Now, I'm going to read something to you about the previous pasuk. Chaya num ani Hashem. He says that you're not going to die in your bed. And once again, I say, what in God's name did he do? I'm reading to you from Otzer HaMidrashim, and the Otzer Midrashim is quoting, I will read and I will translate. He is quoting from the Medrash Tanchuma in Va'era in Sefer Shmos. Asher bizah es olaso, that he denigrated his promise. So he asked, "V'hechan hu bazah es olaso." How did he do? We thought we had a picture about what he did with the fact of the king maybe ate a raw rabbit, whatever it was. Let's hear the whole story. Ella, kach haya hamaseh shata motzei b'tzidkiyahu melech Yehuda. This is the real story. So he says, Kishe Allah tzidkiyahu v'ha'alos dora Nebuchadnezzar. He was going to pay his tribute, going to pay his taxes in person. Listen to this. Omar lo Nebuchadnezzar. He says, Sa'odi mi b'tzarayim. Let's do lunch. V'asa seuda. He made a meal. And he says, for instance, Gedolah u'mifo eres. He made a banquet. V'lo haya ragil b'kach. This was not the way of the Babylonians. Shari ein seudas malchei Bavel keseudas malchei Eretz Yisrael. We know what we heard about what happened in Shlomo's table. Shlomo fed 150,000 people a month, and they didn't just have stew. He says they didn't do the same kind of Suda. But you know what? He made a Suda. Lichvod, in the kavod that it should be for Tzidkiyahu. This is not a little thing. He said, you're coming to pay your taxes, you're coming in person? I want to honor you. So listen. B'shasa Seuda, ichnis lefanav Nebuchadnezzar le'echol basar chai. He brought in raw meat, but he qualifies it. He says, behiv hav. What's behiv hav mean, David? Singed, charred, slightly cooked. He says, and he translated, charuch ba'esh. He says, and maybe you and I like our meat medium or well done, raw, not so much. He says, and Ra'ah Tzidkiyahu Nebuchadnezzar Yeshu Ochel, he's watching Nebuchadnezzar eat burrito, and his saliva, no tev, is flowing b'yorei al zakana, going onto his beard. The guy was into the food, he was enjoying it. What? He was a glutton, but you know what? He was a glutton who was according honor to the king. And he was making a Seuda along the style that a king befits a Jewish king. So listen, Ubiroso kol zeh. Here's Tzidkiyahu watching this. Tzidkiyahu mabit bo v'tamea. He's looking at him and he's absolutely flabbergasted. Amarla, he says, Adam shafel kimo. He says, Zeh, this lowlife, says kol ha'olam mishtat abdin. The world is bowing down to this guy. But Sa'adimo, he ate with him. He broke bread with him. Ma'asa Nebuchadnezzar, what did he do? Mishesa'ad, when he finished eating, Notlo Litzidkiyahu, he grabbed a hold of him. Notal means he grabbed him. The Hishbio, and he made him swear. The Kach or Marlo. Shelo telech la'artzecha. Don't go home. V'tigoleh es ma shera'u einecha. I don't want you going home and talking about what you saw. Maybe he's saying, remember, they don't eat the way we eat in Jerusalem, the way he eats in Babylonia. The Taniach Osi, he says, lehispazos be'enei habrios. I don't want you to embarrass me in front of the people. Niftar mimeno Tzidkiyahu, he left. went home. Ubolo Eretz Yisrael. Says, Umehakia Lisham, he no sooner sets foot in Eretz Yisrael, Yischil Mivazeh also. He starts to embarrass him. Yalma Asav, and what he did immediately. We were talking about a previous story we had in the Durham. The story in the Durham is he says, he's thinking about it. He's thinking about it. And how could I live with this? And I got to go to the Sanhedrin. Another side. I can't tell you who's right, but this is another side of the story. And he says, Ubekach kafar biosa shvua shenishbalo. That's how he broke his oath. But immediately, bial zeh Yechezkel kara alav asher bazah es Allah. So Allah says Allah. So he says he denigrated his oath. Eshvua so shenishbal Nebuchadnezzar ubekach chilel eshem Hashem shenishba bishmo. He swore. Nebuchadnezzar said he may have been dumb, but he wasn't stupid. He made him swear in his own God's name. But listen to this. Shamu es divrei tzidkiyahu, hamalachim shayu mesubin etzlo. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar was the top dog. We were the little dog with other littler dogs around us from 6 nations in a summit. He says, Sholchu bi'amru lo. What did these, I suppose, allies do? They went to Nebuchadnezzar and they said to him, Tzidkiyahu yoshev u'mesachek bach. He's making fun of you. So they ask a question. Where do we know that he swore? That's the crux of this parak. That's the crux of this punishment. Minayin shenishbalo tzidkiyahu. And they bring you a pasuk from Divrei Hayamim. The pasuk says, the Gamba Melech Nebuchadnezzar Morad Asher Hisbiyo Belo Kim. This is not made up. This is Divrei Hayamim. He broke his promise that he swore in God's name. Listen to this. Ma'osa. What did Nebuchadnezzar do? He said, Miyad Shalach Behevio V'haya Ma'achil Oso Sa'olim. He called for him. We have the story in our previous version that he called the Sanhedrin, he gave them golden shares, and he said, can you break an oath? No. Nebuchadnezzar was feeding him animal fodder. Barley is animal fodder. And he stands him up, and he's embarrassing him with prejudice. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, you know what? We can't break an oath, but God can get angry. He says, this is not the way you treat my king. Listen. So I may have made you my instrument, but you know, we say, why are the goyim who act as God's instruments, why are they punished? The answer is because they have too much fun doing it. They go overboard. So he says, Chayecha ein ata Nebuchadnezzar. He says, in my name, he says, ein ata yotzei min ha'olam at shehayu kol habrios sochachin alecha. He says, you made fun of him. You're not going to die until the entire world makes fun of you. Listen to what you do. Shenemar, it says in Daniel, he says, Umin anosha loch tor din. And this is a beautiful parish because he explains every word I don't understand in Aramaic. Mikol ha'anashim yigarshu oscha. They will all throw you out. Below od, elakashem shebazisa oso. The manner in which you embarrassed Tzidkiyahu, kach ata misbazeh b'fnei kol habrios. I'm going to embarrass you the same way that you embarrassed him. Ukemo, maksiv alav, what was written about him? The shod behemos yechisan. That's a pasuk in Habakkuk, and it means, what does it mean? So they said, Amar Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana, Shenaaseh choson L'kol behema v'chaya. You know what it means to be a chassan to every behema and a chaya? In case you don't know, he tells you. Shenidbe lebehemos ke'echad mehem. The behemoths saw him as one of them. They wanted to mate with him. Umi goramlo es abizayon hazeh. Who caused this? Hu atzmo. Al yidei shebiza es Tzidkiyahu. So I say to you, al achas kama v'kama. Tzidkiyahu, basar v'dam, was embarrassed. After all, Tzidkiyahu was king. Tzidkiyahu was a Jewish king. And Nebuchadnezzar decided that because he broke his promise, he would treat him like an animal. Alachas kama v'kama, he says if Tzidkiyahu was treated like an animal by Nebuchadnezzar and God punished him, so Tzidkiyahu gets punished for what he did whilst breaking his oath in God's name. He gets punished. Let's finish up.
But that's not here in the parak. That's just an aside.
That is a Medrash Tanchuma on Parshas Va'era.
Yeah, but that's not in our text here. That's just an aside you're giving us.
Well, guess what? The Malbim isn't in your text either. Neither is the Radak in your text here. Neither is Rabbi Eliezer Balgonsi. Neither is the Marikra. Neither is Rashi.
Yeah, but it's not listed. That's a side story. It's interesting. But it doesn't say anything in here that he's not talking about it in this parak that he's going to punish Nebuchadnezzar. He's only talking about punishing Tzidkiyahu in this parak.
Side, but what we did was lay the foundation for what Tzidkiyahu did. And as a side, do we think that Nebuchadnezzar is going to get away with it? The answer is no, he's not. You're right. That tells you midah keneged midah. That's what we're doing. Okay, so we go forward to pasuk Yud Ches. Ubaza Allah lehafer bris v'hinei nosan yodo. He says he denigrated the oath. He broke the covenant. He says v'hinei and after the asnachla ne nosan yodo. You know what that means? He shook on it. He shook hands on it. The kol ela asol lo yimalek. You really think Tzidkiyahu, you can do all this stuff? You swore in my name, and you broke your word? You think you'd get away with it? Says Rabbanu Shalom. The answer is not so much. Okay. Pasuk Yutes. This is a samach who entered a new Indian. Lachein ko amar Hashem Elokim. Chayani. And lo ola si asher baza ubrisi asher fair. He says, if not for the oath that you broke, he says, and for the covenant that you reneged on, nisativ birosho. Nisativ birosho. If you look at Rashi on your test, who says, unisativ birosho, says, hu simui enough. What's the central, most important feature? I guess it's up for debate. I can't say it. Because what was the punishment?
Blinded.
He was blinded. Blinded, and that's what it says, the Rosho. Now, also, the Yotzar Midrashim says on that pasuk, he says, Imlo Allah si asher bazab risi asher hefer v'satib b'rosho. He says, Eze Allah bazah. What exactly was the oath that he broke? Ella kavanasa pasuk. Listen to this. This is great. Imlo Allah si zu shvuah shenishbal Nebuchadnezzar. What was the oath? Lios mamleches Yehuda kinuah, subservient, tachtav. Pharaoh saw him shich hakasuv ubrisi asher hefir zebrisi shel har Sinai. He said, "You broke your bris with me, the bris from Har Sinai." Imakadosh Baruch Hu b'yavshit Tzidkiyahu hayat tzadik mikol makom Lo macha b'vnei amo. You hear this, David? Tzidkiyahu was considered a tzaddik, but he did not prevent the people from doing what they were doing, which were not good things. V'lachein laka. Therefore, he was punished. U'mashenemar b'pasuk, what it states, when a sativ b'rosho, the chi sha'ar kol haguf lo laka, and he didn't do anything to the rest of his body. Loma tales anasho b'rosho. Why did his punishment consist only of his head? Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman b'shem Rabbi Yonasan, Iker anasho shel tzidkiyahu. Ikar, I mean, the main part of his punishment says simuy einayim, be blinded. Shu talui, he says barosh, the eyes are in the head. Lochein kasav nisativ barosho. That comes from Vayikra Rabbah. So that takes care of pasuk Yud Tes. If there's anything else I wanted to tell you about it, no. But look at pasuk Chaf. Quite interesting. He says uporasti olav rishti. This is not Yechezkel's net. This is not Yirmiyah's net. This is God's net. Uporasti olav rishti. I will spread out my net. He says, "Benis pas b'mitzudasi," and he will be trapped in my trap. The heviosihu bavela. You're going to Bavel. B'nishpatati ito, will judge you sham ma'alo asher ma'al bi. God does not get over the fact of what he did. So if you want to know what this really means, what is the story that God spread a net? You got to go back to Perek Yud Beis. If you have the art scroll, it's page 156, Pasuk Yud Gimel. Same exact words. Uparasti es rishti, I'll spread out my net alav. V'nitpas b'mitzudasi, it's exactly the same. You'll be caught in my trap. Rashi says, Uparasti es rishti alav, says, Me'ara haisa lo. You guys who learned this with me will remember. There was a cave, Mi Beiso at Admos Yericho. There was an underground cave that took him outside the palace gates, took him supposedly to safety. The Yatza Derech HaMa'ara was going to make his escape. The city was going to be, engulfed. Ma'asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu Hevi Tzvi Echad. He brought a deer. Lifnei Chayil Kastim, in front of the Chaldean soldiers, the Hilech Lifneim al Gag HaMa'ara, and he set the deer going back and forth on the roof of the cave in which Tzidkiyahu was escaping. The Haim rode Fimoso. They're chasing the deer. These are Chaldeans. These are not rocket science. Where he wanted to go, they found them. Tafsu, they grabbed them. Biosa lo yir'eh, says kiberov lo haaretz. He says Hamas diber ito mishpatim, and he says he took him there and he was read the riot act by the king. So that's the backstory and what happened. We had this story earlier in our learning of the Sefer. Now, there's an interesting word in Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Yes, kol nivrachav b'chol agapav. Or is it agapav with a dot? Yeah. What's agapav? If you take a look at Sion, he says kinafav, his wings. If you look at Rashi, he says b'chol agapav, b'chol kinafehem klomar b'chol kocham. So with all their strength, as kol nivrachav, all those who were fleeing, with all their might, with swords they shall fall, and yesharim l'chol ruach yiforesu, and they'll be spread to arba kanvos haaretz, yadatem k'ani Hashem dibarti. So that finishes with the punishment section of our parak. So they say sometimes there's just too much bad stuff, and you can't leave it. We've had a lot of bad stuff, but psukim Chaf Bet through Chaf Daled, which end the parak, a Divrei Nechama. Beautiful. Komar and Hashem Elokim, Lokachti Ani, just like he said, Porasti in Pasuk Chaf, I will spread my net. He says, he said, will take. Mitzameres ha'eretz. We talked about the treetop of the tree that was cut off. Haramah, high and mighty. V'nosati me rosh in the Yokosav. This is all the lashon we used about how the eagle will tear off pieces of the tree. Kosav rach, its tender shoots, ektof, v'shatalti ani, and I shall plant it, al har gavoa v'talul. I will plant it, he said, he says, and who is ani? Who are we talking about? Which is to be the last major piece we'll deal with. Who is ani? So Rashi says this takes place in Moshe Mashiach. Metzudas David says on page 258, he says Melech HaMashiach. But guess what? That's not the only explanation. There are other explanations. The Radak says, if you look on page 259, about 3 lines to the end, he said, well, we'll read the Shastalti Ani, I shall plant, when I cut it off from the place where it is, the Tova so, for its benefit, I'll do it to improve it. Kilin to also, to plant it beyond so, that's why I'm cutting it off, to transplant it. He says, B'harach, who's the Rach? Who's the Zerubbabel ben Shealtiel ben Yehoyachin? Whoa. Yehoyachin was the first exile. This is his grandson. Al har gavoa v'talul pa'ul min tail. That means tail, a hill. Sharosh shahar domel, the tail. The top of a mountain is kind of like a hill. I don't know. Maybe a hill is like flat on the top. I don't know. He says, V'hu har tzio. But not the whole story. The Mincha Gedola likes to quote the Abarbanel and differ from him. So he says, and then I'll tell you who Zerubbabel was. Anybody want to venture a guess at who Zerubbabel was? I just happened to do a little bit of research today on Zerubbabel. I'll tell you who he was. Zerubbabel Zerubbabel was the leader of the first group of Jews numbering 42,360 who returned from the Babylonian captivity in the first year of Koresh, king of Persia, 538 BCE. He was descendant of King David, grandson of Yehoiachin, the next to last king of Yehuda. Although his dates are uncertain, Zerubbabel governed Judah for more than 2 decades. It was he who laid the foundation of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and ultimately supervised its completion after several delays. Zerubbabel was apparently afraid that the Jews would be assimilated into the local population, that their religion will consequently be contaminated by these outside influences. That's a story about him. But you know what? And with this, we'll conclude. We'll read the last pasuk and we'll conclude. And he says, pasuk Chav Gimel says, "Bahar Merom Yisrael Eshad Esh Tolenu." I will plant it there. When I saw enough, I will take this leaf, this branch, Yasah Pri, and it'll bear fruit. V'yola Erez, and will grow into a mighty cedar. Will grow in full circle. V'shachnu Tachtav Kol Tzipor. Well, after all, what is an eagle? It's a big bird, but it's a bird. He said, and that eagle who was lopping off treetops will go underneath this tree. Kol kanaf b'tzel deliyosav tishkona. He says, every wing will go underneath it. V'yadu kol atzei hasadeh. We're getting pretty flowery with the metaphors. All the trees of the field, ki ani Hashem ishpalti eitz gavoa. I took a mighty tree and I made it humble. The Higbati ate shafal, and I took a humble tree, the Hovashti ate loch, and I made it into a moist, beautiful tree. The Frachti ate yavesh, he says, and I vivified, I moistened the dry tree. Ani Hashem dibarti ve'osisi. So just to conclude, what the Mincha Gedola had to say about this, he says, well, he says the Abarbanel says that Mefarshim say Zerubbabel by Yesheni, the Kosher Hadavar Be'enai, he says, I don't buy it. Lefisha Zerubbabel lo malach b'Yerushalayim. He said he didn't rule in Jerusalem. I'm not going to argue with the Abarbanel, he knows better than me. Aval ba shama ubanat beis Hashem. Yeah, he came. He built the base of Mikdash, the Chazar LeBavel, Umeis Sham Bi'avduso. He says, and he died there in his Abdus as an Eved, in captivity. So the Mincha Gedola says, yeah, I really don't think. So he says, the Abarbanel, so I really don't think it goes by Zerubbabel. He says, and I don't think this has to do with the base of Mikdash at all. He says, I think it has to do with the Moshe Mashiach. So that kind of goes in line with what Rashi said in Nad Mefarshim. So with this, we have finished Perek Zion. Yes, David.
No, I'm just very quickly. Shachnu tachtav kol tzipor kol kanaf betzel dayotav tishkona. It's all the birds of the world. He was talking about just the eagles before. And he's saying all the birds are all going to live under this tree together. It's like garzevim keves. It's the same thing. The lamb is going to live with the lion. All the birds are going to live together. Definitely sounds messianic era.
Definitely messianic. I totally agree. And also, it's just the beautiful thing that God says, I took a mighty cedar tree, he said, and I brought it low. I took a lowly tree and I made it high. And underneath the tree that was low that I made high, all the birds were flying above it. They're all going to rest underneath it. Messianic, and it's a return to the power structure as to before, because God says and God does, as the pasuk ends. So next week, B'siyata D'Shmaya, the great Simcha of Purim. So we will not be meeting. I want to wish everybody a freilichen Purim and a good evening, and everybody should be well.
Amen.
Chag Purim Sameach. Chag Purim Sameach.
What did David say at the end about the bird?